By 8 o'clock this morning, 6 commercial logging trucks were seized by federal forestry marshals, and my daughter's $600,000 timber deal was completely dead. She stood in the freezing mud of my forest road, her silk scarf covered in pine sawdust, screaming into her cell phone as the marshals placed heavy steel evidence tags on her chainsaws. 5 minutes ago, she thought she was clear-cutting my 200-year-old black walnut trees while I was stranded in a county clinic. She forgot that in the Blue Ridge Mountains, you can buy a piece of dirt, but you can't sell another man's timber trust. To understand how my own daughter ended up facing federal timber theft charges on the very mountain where she learned to walk, you have to go back 3 weeks. My name is Caleb Vance. I am 74 years old. I spent 51 years running a water-powered sawmill on Chestnut Creek in western North Carolina. My hands are wide, calloused, and missing the tip of my right index finger from a circular saw blade slip in 1984. My skin is dark from 50 summers of mountain sun, and my shoulders are bent from carrying green oak beams up riverbanks. My wife, Hannah, passed away 7 years ago from heart failure. She left behind our only daughter, Jessica. Jessica was the light of my life when she was small. I spent 30 years working 60 hours a week so she would never have to touch a rusty tool. I paid off her 4-year degree in international finance at the University of North Carolina. I bought her first brick townhouse in Charlotte when she got her first corporate job. Jessica drives a black European sports car, wears hand-tailored coats, and married a senior investment banker named Richard, a man who has never held an axe in his entire life and thinks timber is just something you read about on a stock ticker. On the north ridge of my 80 acres sits 40 acres of virgin black walnut timber. Those trees were planted by my grandfather in 1926. They are massive, straight, and deep dark green in the summertime. I spent my entire adult life refusing every timber speculator who drove up my gravel road with a checkbook. Those trees weren't firewood to me. They were my family's roots. 3 weeks ago, during a heavy spring rainstorm, a massive hemlock log jammed in the iron water wheel behind the mill. I was out on the wooden catwalk in the dark, trying to pry the log loose with a heavy steel crowbar, when my boots slipped on the wet moss. I fell 12 feet onto the granite river rocks below. The impact snapped 3 of my ribs and badly dislocated my right hip. I lay in that freezing mountain creek for nearly 3 hours before my apprentice, Sam, found me unconscious and called an ambulance. I was rushed to the regional hospital in Waynesville, hooked up to intravenous pain medication and oxygen. While I was laying in that hospital bed, barely able to turn my head without screaming from the pain in my chest, Jessica and Richard saw their chance. 4 years ago, when my wife Hannah passed away, I had signed a standard medical power of attorney giving Jessica authority to handle my hospital billing if I was ever incapacitated. Jessica didn't use that document to settle my medical expenses. She took that old power of attorney to a corporate notary in Charlotte, filed emergency petition claiming I suffered from permanent cognitive decline due to trauma, and transferred the commercial surface rights of my land to her own name. The moment she had the legal transfer, she didn't wait for me to heal. 2 days later, Jessica brought 3 corporate timber buyers from an international furniture firm in Atlanta to my North Ridge. They surveyed the black walnut trees, measuring the trunk diameters with steel tapes. They offered Jessica $600,000 in cash for the clear-cut harvesting rights to the entire ridge. They wired her a $200,000 non-refundable advance deposit that very afternoon. When the county medical transport van brought me back to Chestnut Creek on a cold Thursday afternoon, my front gate was locked. A heavy steel logging cable was wrapped around the wooden posts, secured with a massive brass padlock. 2 giant diesel logging skidders were idling in my front gravel driveway, churning my grass into deep mud. When I stepped out of the van on my wooden crutches, Jessica was standing by the porch of my farmhouse wearing a long wool coat, holding a leather binder. "What is this cable on my gate, Jessica?" I asked, my voice trembling from the pain in my broken ribs. Jessica stepped down off the porch steps, her expression cold, polished, and devoid of any warmth. "The doctor confirmed you'll never operate the water wheel again, Dad," Jessica told me, her voice flat and professional like a bank manager. "A commercial forestry firm from Atlanta bought the harvesting rights for the North Ridge. The logging crews arrive tomorrow morning. I've used part of the advance check to pay off Richard's corporate firm tax liability, and I've secured you a private room at an assisted living facility in Asheville. Your clothes and personal papers are already packed in cardboard boxes in the trunk of my car." I stood on my wooden crutches in the freezing mud of my own driveway. The cold wind came howling off the Blue Ridge peaks, carrying the scent of damp pine and cold earth. I looked at the girl I used to carry on my shoulders through these exact woods. I looked at her husband, Richard, who was leaning against their sports car, tapping his leather shoes on the gravel. I didn't scream at her. I didn't wave my crutches in the air. "A child who cuts down her grandfather's trees to pay for a carpet in Charlotte," I said softly, my breath clouding in the mountain air, "is going to find out that mountain shade is hard to buy back when the sun gets hot." Jessica didn't look me in the eye. She set a yellow envelope with $800 in cash on the hood of the medical van, turned her back on me, and walked inside my house. I refused to get into the van to Asheville. I told the driver to unload my canvas duffel bag and leave me at the wooden bridge at the foot of the valley. When the van drove away, I dragged my swollen leg and broken ribs 2 miles up the rocky creek bed. On the far edge of my property sat an old wooden dry kiln shed built by my father in 1938. It had a tin roof that rattled in the wind, a rusted cast-iron wood stove, and a dirt floor covered in cedar shavings. I spent $40 of my remaining cash buying 3 sacks of dried beans, 2 boxes of paraffin candles, a box of matches, and 5 gallons of kerosene from a neighbor's farm stand. For 18 days, I lived in that drafty wooden shed. I chopped pine kindling with one arm, taking small, agonizing swings with a hand hatchet. I boiled creek water in a tin pot over the wood stove to wash my face. I slept under 3 heavy wool army blankets on a narrow pine bench, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the walls. In the quiet dark of those mountain nights, the pain in my body tried to break my spirit. I thought about Hannah. I thought about how we sat on the front porch 50 years ago when we were young, watching the moon rise over the black walnut trees. I thought about how easy it would be to accept the warm room in Asheville, sit in a carpeted hallway, and let someone else worry about my meals. Every time my mind weakened, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my grandfather's original 1926 leather-bound land notebook. It was bound in dark calfskin, stained with linseed oil, and stamped with the copper seal of the North Carolina Forestry Board. If you let a thief keep what they stole just because you are old and tired, you aren't choosing peace, you are choosing surrender. And an Appalachian sawyer does not surrender his forest to anyone. "I am Caleb Vance," I whispered into the dark, cold shed, "and as long as water runs down Chestnut Creek, no saw touches my ridge without my mark." Jessica and her banker husband made one fatal mistake. They were city financial workers who believed trees were like corporate shares of stock, that whoever holds the surface deed owns everything that grows on the dirt. They knew corporate contract law, but they knew nothing about Appalachian timber reservation laws. In 1926, when my grandfather established the family property, he did not file a simple land deed. He registered the entire 40 acres of black walnut timber under a permanent state timberland trust under Section 74 of the North Carolina Forestry Statutes. Under state law, standing hardwood timber registered under a historical trust is legally classified as protected real heritage. It cannot be clear-cut, sold, or exported without a physical certificate of authorization bearing the embossed steel seal of the registered master sawyer named in the trust. Jessica had the surface deed through her fraudulent power of attorney, but she did not have the master sawyer seal. She thought cutting 200-year-old trees was just a matter of signing a contract and hiring chainsaws. She had just committed felony timber theft under federal law. I didn't call a lawyer in Charlotte. On Wednesday morning, I walked 3 miles down the mountain road to the regional office of the State Forestry Commission in Waynesville. I laid my grandfather's 1926 leather-bound trust document on the desk of Chief Marshal James Crawford, a man whose father had worked at my mill 40 years ago. On Friday morning at 8 o'clock, the logging crew began their heavy operations on the North Ridge. The roar of giant diesel engines echoed through the valley. The first massive 200-year-old black walnut tree groaned, cracked, and crashed to the forest floor, sending a cloud of damp bark into the air. Jessica and Richard stood by their black sports car at the edge of the clearing, drinking coffee from paper cups, smiling as the loggers loaded the giant logs onto 6 flatbed trucks. That's when 3 green state forestry patrol trucks and 2 federal marshal cruisers pulled up the narrow dirt road, blue lights flashing through the morning mist. The lead marshal stepped out of his truck and held up a megaphoned hand. "Shut down every saw and skidder engine immediately!" Marshal Crawford's voice boomed across the logging clearing. The loggers immediately cut their engines. The forest went dead silent. Jessica ran over to the lead cruiser, her face red with frustration and arrogance. "What is the meaning of this?" Jessica demanded, waving her leather binder. "This is private property. I hold the legal conservatorship deed for this land. Chief Marshal Crawford pulled a white laminated federal order from his dark coat. Under North Carolina Forestry Statute, Section 74, Crawford announced, his voice echoing through the standing trees, this parcel is an active historical timberland trust. Attempting to cut or commercialize trust timber without a signed release and physical seal from the registered master sawyer is a Class 3 felony. Every log on these trucks is now impounded as federal criminal evidence. And the international buyer who wired your advance deposit was notified 1 hour ago. The purchase contract is legally void. Richard dropped his paper coffee cup into the mud, his face draining of all color. "What are you talking about?" Richard screamed, grabbing Jessica's arm in a panic. "We already spent that $200,000 advance to pay off our firm's back taxes in Charlotte. If that deal is canceled, the bank files criminal fraud charges against our firm by 5 o'clock today." I walked out from the shadow of the tall walnut trees, leaning heavily on my wooden walking stick, wearing my canvas work coat. I stood 5 feet from my daughter. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel like shouting. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the cold brass master sawyer seal, and held it up in the morning light. "Choices have roots, Jessica," I said softly, my voice carrying clear through the silent forest. "When you cut down the trees that sheltered you just to buy a carpet in the city, you don't own the forest. You just cut away the only ground that was keeping you from falling." Chief Marshal Crawford stepped forward and placed formal impoundment notices on the logging skidders and Richard's sports car to satisfy the forestry investigation fees. Jessica stood in the mud of the logging road, her high heels sinking into the dirt, her expensive wool coat covered in wet sawdust. She realized right then that her Charlotte bank accounts and her fancy corporate title meant nothing to the state marshals or the ancient mountain trees. She had traded 30 years of family trust for a deposit check she couldn't keep. 2 weeks later, the heavy steel cable was gone from my front gate. My apprentice, Sam, and I sat on the wooden steps of the sawmill, drinking hot black tea out of tin mugs, listening to the steady, rhythmic splash of the water wheel turning in Chestnut Creek. On the wooden workbench behind us sat my grandfather's leather-bound notebook and the brass seal. Up on the north ridge, the remaining black walnut trees stood tall and green against the afternoon sky, their leaves rustling softly in the mountain breeze. Sam took a sip of his tea, looking out over the quiet forest. "Do you think Jessica will ever come back up this mountain, Caleb?" Sam asked quietly. I picked up my tea mug, feeling the warm steam against my weathered face, and looked out at the green ridge. "When you cut the roots of a tree just to reach the fruit, Sam," I said softly, watching the evening sun cast golden light across the water, "you don't get to complain when the whole thing falls on your head.